Will Surgeon, thank you for talking to me.
Pleasure, William.
Before we go to the events of the evening of the 24th of June 1978,
Yes.
Can you tell me what your involvement with LGBTIQ queer activism was?
Yes, I certainly can. It began in 1972 when I was 21, which was probably a little bit later for some people. And as I say, I think I suffered with Freudian repression. And I suddenly decided that I was gay and homosexual, and I had no idea how to go about it, and I didn't know anyone. So I started telling friends, look, I've decided this is how I am, but I don't know how to go about it. If you know anyone or where I can go, and my friends didn't. And it was leading on to May 72, and of course George Duncan was drowned. And I had heard that men went down to the river to meet, and I thought, well, that's probably not such a good idea. And at that time my sister Susie was a student at Adelaide University, and we were flatting together because we come from the country, and she brought home a flyer about a new group being formed called Adelaide Gay Liberation Front. So as I say, I was that year had taken a year off study, and I was working in a chartered accountant's office in the city, and every Friday night the boys would go drinking, and trying to be a boy I would go drinking with them too. It was in Curry Street, and I knew that the Gay Liberation Front was meeting at the Women's Liberation Centre in Bloor Court. So as I say, that night after drinking with the boys from the accounting firm, I crossed the road, went to my first gay liberation meeting, and my life was never the same again. I'd found my tribe, if you like.
The Gay Liberation Front meetings, was that based on the meetings in the group in the US and the UK, to GLF? Yes,
that's right, yes. And it was sort of sitting around chatting about radical ideas and the importance of coming out and declaring yourself. So there was a lot of talk. At that stage, not much action, and also I think the idea of raising your consciousness, it was kind of a consciousness raising group. So we were...
and you were in Adelaide, of course.
In Adelaide, yes, yes.
Was there much of a gay scene? Obviously it hadn't been decriminalised, homosexuality, but what was there for gay men? Right,
yes, well there was certainly a number of pubs, the Ambassadors in the city, and very famous one, the Buckingham Arms. So it's early 72, so 6 o'clock closing had finished, so pubs did stay open till 10 at night. But because I got involved with the Gay Liberation Group, and mainly people from university and students, perhaps late teens, early 20s, they were the sorts of people that perhaps weren't engaged with the older camp scene and the pub scene. So there was a bit of not a demarcation, but we didn't really move in that set or that circle. So I didn't really get into the pub scene, and I suppose we formed our own kind of social milieu from those gay liberation meetings. That's how I recall it. So that was the latter part of 1972. Then in 1973 I returned to full-time study, and Adelaide Gay Activist Alliance was formed. So that was much more of an activist group rather than sitting and talking. We got out on the streets and we did things, zaps, activity, confrontation of homophobia, that sort of thing. And we had a rally on the steps of Parliament House, not just for law reform, but for removal of discrimination on every level. And then, of course, in September that year, Gay Pride Week, held in Adelaide, Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane, I think. And one of the highlights of that was the first Gay Pride March. And indeed, I was the eye in Pride leading the parade. And they were very heady, exciting times.
Was that the first in Australia?
Yeah, that's my understanding of that Gay Pride Week, of those marches in those cities, I think were the first Gay Pride marches ever.
What was the reaction from the public?
I remember coming down what was the main shopping street at just before closing time, because I think shops closed about noon in those days, and so the shoppers were milling on the main shopping street, Rundle Street, and certainly not antagonism, but I think slight bemusement. What is this? You know, homosexual liberation. And of course we were chanting and singing, and it was very colourful, it was very celebratory, and yes, that's my recall of, my goodness, what is this? And of course the word gay was quite a new word in our lexicon in Australia, so some people still thought it was just being happy. Yes.
What brought you to Sydney?
Right, well, I stayed on in Adelaide for a few years, and I worked as an accountant. And then I went to see the world in 1976. And when I came back, I thought, well, it's time for a new experience. So at the beginning of 77, I moved to Sydney.
And when you went to see the world in 1976,
Yes.
did any of those travelling experiences influence your own beliefs?
Not especially. I had some exposure to the gay world in the United States. I spent 2 months in the United States first, in San Francisco and in New York City, and I had contacts, so I met young radical gay people and went to bars and socialised. So that was pretty exciting, from a little boy from Adelaide who'd never really been anywhere, first time in the world.
Would have been quite a culture shock.
Yes, yes, and perhaps felt a little bit of a country bumpkin, you know, in that situation, but that was pretty wonderful. And then in London, and the gay scene was around Earl's Court.
In West London?
Yes.
West Kensington area?
Yeah, that's right. Remember going to some bars and things. I didn't in those days go to saunas, so that wasn't part of my experience, and I think the experience might have been somewhat different or expanded if I'd been a steam queen, as we say.
Do you remember any of those bars in Earl's Court?
Was there one called the Coal Pit or the Coal Yard? It was quite
Not
a big...
the Coleherne? The Coleherne?
Yes, that's right.
Absolutely, yes.
That's right.
Very famous, closed
Yes.
a few years ago.
Yes, I can remember spending some time there and socialising there. And I did have a few gay contacts in London, so socialising with them.
Were you involved in any groups there?
No. And then what I did for the summer of 76, I bought a bicycle and I cycled from London to John of Groats and back again.
Which you've done again, haven't you?
I did for the 40th anniversary last year, yes, to prove I could still do it 40 years on, yes.
Before we get back to Sydney,
Yes.
I asked you the public reaction to the parades in Adelaide.
Yes.
What was the police reaction?
I can remember it just being very, no problem. You know, we had permission for the march, of course, the parade. So, you know, they were there, almost a little bit conspicuous by their absence. They were there was no problem, no problem with people on the street. So it just all ran very smoothly. That was my recall.
You went to Sydney in 1977.
Yes.
What are your memories of gay Sydney?
Right. Again, I was flirting with a gay friend that I met through the Gay Liberation Network over those early years, and he had a circle of friends. So I guess mixed mainly, socialising mainly with that sort of gay lib type group and those sorts of radical lefty sort of people. We would go to the bars sometimes, the Bottoms Up Bar and the Rex and Capriccios, I remember, and I think it was Patches then, which perhaps had become the midnight shift. So we would go to bars. Again, occasionally I'd go to the steam bars, Ken's Karate Club, I remember very well, but I wasn't really into that.
Were you involved in any activism?
Not really. It was slightly for me post-activism, and again I was working in the hotel industry and shift work, and sometimes you were working weekends and late shifts. So that sets up a bit of a different rhythm of life.
You worked in Coogee, didn't you?
I did. I first lived in Coogee and worked at the Oceanic Hotel Coogee as a bar, behind the bar, and then a reception. And I can always remember, I have one clear memory. I am a Republican, but I've got an emotional association with royalty, and it was Queen Elizabeth's Silver Jubilee, and they were 77, they were photographing something, and I was working in the front bar, and I made all these sort of rugga-bugga off Australian types watch this whole thing about the Queen's Jubilee on television, which was pretty unusual, but they obviously respected me at some level, and no, Will wants to watch it, we'll let him watch it.
Very, very respectable. So in 1978,
yes, there
was what was the Mardi Gras in the evening.
That's right.
How did you find out about the events of that day?
Right. Well, as I say, I was working in the bars. I know I was on duty that weekend, but obviously it was on day shift, both I think on the Saturday and the Sunday, and I was living in Roslyn Gardens, Elizabeth Bay, with my friend Terry, living in a flat there.
Were you partners?
Not partners, no friends, flatmates. We've always been flatmates, and we maintain our friendship to this day. And Terry was a little bit more involved, and he went to the conference, the conference, which I think was in Paddington House.
It was in Paddington, but there was a morning protest down George Street.
Yes, he may well have gone to that, because I know I was working that morning. I didn't, but
so you were working.
Yeah, and I was off in the evening, and Terry said, "There's the evening parade, we must go." So I remember, therefore, we went on the evening parade, and I went with Terry and a group of our friends.
And where did it start from?
Well, again, recall 40 years on, William, is patchy. And I think about this. My recall is meeting in, coming up from Roslyn Gardens, meeting in Taylor Square. And I clearly remember walking down Oxford Street. And of course, it was a cold winter's night. It was late June, 28th of June. It was
24th of June.
24th, sorry. Was 28th is actually Stonewall Day, isn't it? So
I couldn't.
Well, it was late June. It was the Saturday evening, wasn't it? And it was pretty cold. And I remember not dressing up for that first one, just being in street clothes. There were people who were dressed up, of course, but we didn't. Terry and I and our group of friends.
So you were just wearing average clothes?
Yeah, 70s weeds, flares,
And when you got to Taylor Square, what sort of numbers of people?
You see, I haven't a clear recall. My recall of sort of marching down Oxford Street, it felt a good number. Probably, it wouldn't be more than 200, I don't think. Over 100, something like that. But it felt a respectable number.
What was the atmosphere like in Taylor Square?
It was pretty celebratory. It was kind of fun. And I remember we had the truck in the front, and it seemed to me, I'm not into popular music, but it sounded sort of like hoedownish type music. It was kind of quite loud and upbeat, and to elevate the feeling of celebration and fun. That was the sense I had. Because I wasn't popular, I wouldn't be able to tell you what the actual music was or what the numbers were. Whether they were Shirley Bassey numbers or what, I don't know.
And it went down Oxford Street?
Went down Oxford Street. And I do remember there weren't, because it wasn't late, it was after dark, so there didn't seem to be a lot of people on the street. There were a few people walking up and down. And with the gay bars, I do remember some people coming out on the street and sort of looking, again, a little bit bemused. What is this? What's going on? And I think some people probably joined.
Was there any chanting?
Look, again, I remember the music from the truck. I don't, as opposed to the Pride March here in 73, where we were chanting.
What were your chants then?
2, 4, 6, 8, gay is twice as good as straight, that sort of thing. 3, 5, 7, 9, try it our way just one time. 1 in 20 of you is one of us, and I was holding that sign. And we were singing, we invented a song to the tune of the Teddy Bears Picnic. If you go out in the streets today, you better go in disguise. If you go out in the streets today, you're in for a big surprise. For every gay that ever there was, it is out in the street today, because today's the day that all the gays are marching. I remember that. I remember seeing that in Adelaide, but I can't recall singing or chanting like that.
One of the chants that I often hear about was out of the bars and into the streets.
Right.
Did you hear any of that that you recall?
Probably we did, but I can't recall particularly.
And as you went down Oxford Street,
yes.
So you talked about the atmosphere in Taylor Square. What was it like going down Oxford Street? Were people running? Were they walking?
No, I think just walking. Again, my clearest recall is a little bit later. Yes, so it seemed sort of fairly orderly. I wouldn't say tame, but to me, it didn't have the exuberance that I remembered of the Pride March in Adelaide of 73, which was a daytime march. It was sort of noon, late morning, early afternoon.
Were people cheering down Oxford Street or
not
clapping
especially,
or dancing?
Not especially. It just seemed to me more of a march, really. A Pride March, more than a celebratory parade. That's the thing. And of course it was pretty cold. It was dark. It was nighttime. It was June. And I think, summer and light and energy gives a different energy.
The police presence, because
yes.
the police did play a major role on that night of the 24th
later.
of June.
Yes.
But do you remember the police in Taylor Square?
No, I can't remember particularly the police presence. I'm sure they were there, and I'm sure they were monitoring it, but it's not a clear recall of the numbers or what they were doing. So I don't think my recall is they weren't particularly conspicuous.
Even down Oxford Street itself?
Yes, they were probably walking down the sides monitoring it, but yes, again.
And so where did the parade go to?
Well, that was my next clear memory, when we got to Hyde Park by the museum and Sydney Grammar, and we were brought to a halt, and I thought that was to be the end of the parade. And I know there was some sort of kerfuffle. Again, I wasn't right up the front. I don't know whether I was avoiding it, but we were sort of milling around and what are we going to do? And then we were aware there was some sort of problem.
Do you know what it was?
No, I don't. In retrospect, I think...
Lance Gowland was in the truck, and
they were going to confiscate the truck, is that?
Well, they were trying to drag Lance out the truck, and people were trying to make sure the police couldn't get him.
Right.
But you didn't witness that.
No. But I knew there was something going on.
How did you know that?
We were sort of milling around. I can't remember avoiding it as such. And there, how many were there? 100, 200 people just sort of milling on, what are we going to do? Is this it? And I remember feeling sort of quite imbued, and the night was still youngish, and what are we going to do now, sort of thing, I think was the sense. And then we were aware that there was some sort of issue going on, some problem. And then I remember the truck seemed to disappear, and there's an announcement, we're going to march to the cross. Come on, let's do it. And it seemed an exciting thing to do. As I say, the night was still young. Yes, come on. And it seemed a bit transgressive, because my sense, we didn't have permission to do this. So we were actually going to break the law, break our permit. And that seemed quite an exciting thing.
But was there a permit to go down Oxford Street?
That's my understanding. It was all legitimate till then. That was my understanding.
So to Hyde Park?
Yes.
And then how did you get to the cross?
Well, we marched up William Street. I remember that. And that was exciting because we were breaking the law.
What was the mood like? Were people angry?
No, I think it was, yes, empowering. We are sort of taking on the police. We're taking on the law. We're doing something we're not quite supposed to be doing. So that transgressive aspect, I think there was a spirit of that. It buoyed us up. I remember feeling quite excited by that.
Were people watching as you were going up?
I think so. Well, that was the main thoroughfare, and traffic going up to the cross. And this is later. Is this sort of 10ish by this stage? I'm not quite sure. I don't have a real sense of the time. But
so do you remember what time Mardi Gras started?
No, I don't. To me, it was after dark. That's just, and certainly, I'm sure going down Oxford Street, it was after dark, and Hyde Park was after dark. So it must have been a few hours on. So that's why I think it must have been 10 o'clock. 10 p.m. plus.
And were the police interfering as you were going up William Street?
No, I was quite amazed. I thought there could be trouble and potential for trouble. But they seemed to give us a head. I had a sense of them being at the front, because that's a major road thoroughfare, of course, too, and traffic going up to the cross and through to the eastern suburbs. It's a main thoroughfare. And so they just seemed to let us have our way. And I remember some police down the sides too, but I can't recall any problem.
No hassling?
No.
Nothing.
And then we got to the top of the cross with the big Coca-Cola sign, and sort of, what are we going to do now? Let's go down Darlinghurst Road. And I remember that being very exciting.
Which direction did you go down?
Down towards El Alamein Fountain. And that was exciting because it's a much narrower street, and that caused a lot of energy when you're packed into a narrow street. And I'm sure there was still 100 plus 200 people, so great energy. And of course, the cross was starting to take off for the night. So
how were you feeling?
Still really excited, exhilarated. There were people on the street, a lot more people, a narrow street, much more energy, much more concentrated energy. And of course, the sex workers, they came out and they were cheering us on, because they're no friends of the police. And I think there was a sense that we were doing something transgressive. So go, it was very exciting. And so that gave us more energy. And I think, the people that went across, not that it was a particularly gay area, but I think they sensed that we were doing something that the police hadn't approved of. So I don't quite know how I got that sense, but everyone seemed to be cheering us on.
Many police?
Not enormous. Down the side and at the front, a certain number, but it didn't seem overwhelming. It didn't seem as if we were headed for trouble. And then we got down to El Alamein Fountain, and we gathered there in the park there. And again, I think it was a bit of a sense of, now what are we going to do? We've got to the next stage. What will we do now? And I know some people were all for continuing and marching down Macleay Street. And I thought, well, can't quite see the point of that, because it didn't have the energy of Darlinghurst Road. It was more residential. There weren't a lot of bars and things down there. And it was a bit of a den at Woolloomooloo. And I thought, potentially that could be a bit dangerous. We could get trapped down there. And I personally didn't think that was a great idea. I can't remember whether I expressed that to my friends or what at that stage. And then I do recall, this is the next memory, of a police barricading Macleay Street. And so we would have to have taken on that barricade to progress down Macleay Street. And then some sort of announcement by the police asking us or telling us to disperse. But again, I can't remember it being really aggressive. Just saying, please disperse. This is it. And as I say, we'd been on the street for some hours by that stage, and they'd given us this license to march up William Street and down Darlinghurst Road, which had been really exciting. And I thought, well, I think we've made our point. I think we've done enough. That was pretty good.
When you say license, you don't mean a legal license.
No, I mean the license to do that.
Yes.
Yes, permission, you know.
Formal permission. Or,
no, not formal. No, it was kind of, they'd allowed it.
They created the situation.
Yeah, and they'd allowed it and hadn't interfered with our progress to that point. And I do somehow remember some people suggesting we were being entrapped then by this blockage of Macleay Street.
Did you feel entrapped?
I didn't, and asking, there were quite a lot there, but I didn't feel, God, we can't get out of this. How am I going to escape? I had no sense of that. I mean, we could have gone down to Elizabeth Bay Road, for example, and gone off that way. Could have gone back down to Roslyn Gardens to my place, for example. But I thought, well, perhaps it's time to go and have a drink. You know, we've been on the street for hours.
So you were able to walk away?
Yes, that is my recall of walking back down Darlinghurst Road. It was a street, the footpath, not the road.
Yes.
The footpath on the left-hand side, I remember that, and with some friends, and thinking we'd go and have a drink. We'd go back up to Taylor Square to one of the bars up there, because that was the main strip.
But did you witness any violence?
Well, that's when I did, William. Walking back down Darlinghurst Road to the top of the cross on our way to Taylor Square to go and have a drink. That's when we started to witness the violence. We were on the street, and I had the sense that some people were so excited, and some people, they just couldn't get off the street. They just didn't want to get off the street. And that's when the police moved in, and people who were on the street in Darlinghurst Road, that's when they started to brutalise them, really attack them. The paddy wagons arrived. They were manhandling people very vigorously, and I think you could say brutally, and throwing people, you know, casting them into the paddy wagon. And that was quite a bit of a conflict. What does one do?
What did you do?
Yeah. I'd never been involved in any violence in any of the demonstrations I've been in. I'm really anti-violence. I hate violence. I hope I'm not a coward, but I had to make a decision. I thought, if I go back on the streets, I'm going to be involved in that violence. What's the point? The police are going to have their way. But do you go and fight with your brothers and sisters who are being brutalised, who are being attacked, who are being thrown in paddy wagons, even though they could have, well, at that stage they probably couldn't have got off the street. They'd made their decision and the police moved in. So I decided to keep walking. I didn't, just kept walking on my way with some friends to a bar.
Towards Taylor Square, Oxford Street.
And so I recall all that action being in that section of Darlinghurst Road from Ella Alamein Fountain up to the top to the Coca-Cola sign. So I haven't a clear recall then of walking further down Darlinghurst Road to the cross, but to Taylor Square, but obviously did. And I can't remember there being a problem in that section.
Were you terrified? Were you in shock?
I think not shocked, but sort of concerned, and I don't know whether feeling a bit of a coward. Should I should I have stayed? Should I have got on the street and fought? I think I did have that conflict.
With hindsight, do you think would you have reacted any differently?
Oh, that's difficult.
It's a tough question, and maybe not a fair one.
I just don't know. Perhaps in hindsight, perhaps I wished I'd stood there and fought, got onto the street. Perhaps I did feel a bit of a coward, sort of walking on. Not walking away, but just walking on. Perhaps I wished I had.
But who knows what would have happened if you had...
Well, I probably would have been thrown to paddy-wagon, arrested, and then I would have been a real hero. So, yeah,
You're still a hero for being involved. So you went to Taylor Square.
Yeah.
What happened?
Yeah, look, it's again memory. I don't have a clear recall. Whether I had too many drinks, I don't know.
So you went to a pub?
Yeah, I'm sure we went drinking. Look, I can't even recall exactly with whom I was, or how many drinks I had, or where we went. And I can't remember. You see, now, when I think about it, in fact, am I going to contradict myself? I could have gone on and had a drink. Yeah, I remember getting up to the Coca-Cola sign at the top of the cross, but did I peel back and go home, back to Ross and Gardens? Was I working? I was working the next day, but was it a morning shift, an afternoon shift? I can't be clear. So having thought about that, because the thing is, William, I haven't a clear recall after that of the rest of my night. What I do know is I didn't go to the police station where the others assembled at the Darlinghurst police station where some of the people arrested were taken.
At what point did you find out what had happened to them?
It must have been the next day.
Was it the papers? Did somebody tell you?
Well, no, it would have been word of mouth the next day. Probably, I should have chatted to my friend Terry with whom I was sharing. Did he go to the police station? Because he wasn't working that weekend, he was going to the conference. I'm sure he would have told me the next day.
Have you any idea of how many people were arrested?
No, I didn't at that stage. And I do know at the subsequent, there was a demonstration at the courthouse when the charges, again, I know I was working that day. So I didn't go to that rally because I was working.
So you weren't there, but you were aware that most of the charges, in fact, were dropped. But how do you feel all these years later? Are you mentally scarred?
No, not at all. I think my most exhilarating memory was walking up William Street and down the cross and knowing that we were doing something we didn't have permission to. It was quite transgressive and it was really exhilarating, and the applause from the street in Darlinghurst Road was really uplifting and wonderful, and that's my clearest, best memory of that night before the trouble.
There's been 3 apologies. In 2016 there was the apology from Fairfax, the Sydney Morning Herald.
Publishing all the names and the occupations and addresses and all, yes.
How do you feel about that apology?
Well, I think that's quite right, that they should have. Yes, I think that was very invasive, given the tenor of the time and that male homosexual sex was still illegal in New South Wales. You know, I think that was as they should have, yep.
And there was also a parliamentary apology from the New South Wales Parliament. How did you feel about that?
That apology was for the brutality, the behaviour of the police. What was that apology for exactly?
It was an apology for all the events that had happened at the time and how they'd been treated and everything.
I think that was quite right too, and I appreciate that. You know...
you weren't at the apology, were you?
No.
So you can't really talk about the actual events during... Have you ever seen the actual apology?
No.
It was delivered by Bruce Notley-Smith, who's a Liberal New South Wales politician, and other people did speeches, but it wasn't delivered by the Premier. Do you think it should have been delivered by the Premier, or does it not matter?
Well, I suppose the Premier is the top person.
The top person?
And I think that would have more kudos if it had been the Premier. You wonder whether they don't think it's important enough, you know. I think it was our Premier here, Jay Weatherall, who delivered an apology here. So I think that would certainly have been appreciated, and perhaps it's slightly disappointing it wasn't the Premier.
And you'd witnessed a lot of the violence from the police.
Yes.
There was a police apology too from the New South Wales Police. Do you accept that apology?
Yes, I mean, it's a difficult one. The tenor of the times, isn't it? And the attitude, I don't excuse what they did, and it was awful to see. Yes, I do. Perhaps, I'm sure in retrospect they could have handled it differently if they'd said, you know, more even-handedly, please get off the street. This is now a motorised thoroughfare. Please move, and much more gently dealt with people who were still on the road.
Would you describe the events in King's Cross as a riot?
Possibly. It does have colour, the word, doesn't it? Right? It gives a
Powerful
sense of energy. You know, a riot to me suggests a lot more people. There was certainly quite a few people on the street, and it was brutal and violent, and I suppose that you associate that with a riot. But I do associate the word riot more with a great mass of people, and I didn't have that sense, but that's just my personal recall.
You described police throwing people into the vans, the paddy wagons. Did you see police use their batons at all, or anything like that, or their fists?
I was aware of struggling.
Yes.
You know, and when they're struggling, and people on the road, and people struggling to get away from the police, and the police holding people down. Perhaps I didn't want to look too closely. I can't honestly remember batons, but people seemed brutal and overzealous use of force, and people being cast into paddy wagons, you know, not gently placed. Or
you don't.
Because people were struggling, you know.
You don't often take part in Mardi Gras these days, but how do you feel about the police marching?
Well, I think it's a great thing. Yeah, yes. I think it's excellent and appropriate, and you know, there's been much more education of the police there about queer people and queer communities and attitude, and so times have moved on in that regard. And you know, at our Pride Parade here in Adelaide, for Pride March, the police now march and they hand out their glow cards, and there's a sense of respect for our community. How
do you feel to be a 78er?
Well, I wear it as a bit of a badge of honour, you know. I've been described in a published work as an unreconstructed 1970s gay liberationist, and I wear that as a badge of honour, and I still hold on to some of the gay ideology from the 70s. I support marriage equality and non-discrimination as a human rights issue, but I don't want to see monogamous coupledom held up as the only way to live. There are many other ways of living and loving, and I think gay liberation was very much about that, and I hold to that ideology very strongly.
And that was a question I was going to ask you nearer the end, but I'll ask as you brought it up.
Yes.
A lot of the 78ers I've interviewed have talked about gay liberation back in 1978.
Yes.
Often the message of Mardi Gras these days is one of equality. Can equality and gay liberation work hand in hand? Or are they a contradiction?
I don't think they're a contradiction. You know, I think equal rights and all people being treated equally before the law. But challenging orthodox social norms that people think it's the only way to live and love. Mm-hmm. And as I say, I think that's what gay liberation stood for. And I think it's very important to continue challenging orthodoxy on all levels.
Do you still take part in the Sydney Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras?
I will for the 40th anniversary. I didn't for a number of years. I was in Sydney to 82 and would go every year to 82, and that was the first year they had the party, and I certainly dressed up that year. I went back for a number of years, in 92 for a few years, and then for the 1998 for the 20th anniversary. My friend Terry and I dressed up, and we were in the press, and the reportage was that we were involved with the riot, and we were attacked by the police and thrown to paddy wagons.
You were misquoted, weren't you?
I was misquoted. But as a historian said to me, when they rewrite history in your favour, don't argue.
Absolutely.
And then, so 98 was the last time. 2008 for the 30th anniversary, and now I'll go for the 40th.
And in 2008, did they have the 78er bus, the famous double-decker bus?
We marched, I remember that.
As part of the 78er group?
Yes.
So how does it feel marching as a 78er and all the crowd applauding you and cheering you on?
Well, it's rather exciting. You feel you've done something important and have helped generate change in attitude and laws, and I think that's important. And I think we really did. You know, we were the first, our generation. And of course, one of our chants from that time, which I still hold on to very strongly, the personal is political. You know, it's I am, is one of the most important statements you can make, and for people to know you as a gay queer person, they like you as a person, and they know you as an out queer person, is still hugely important, and it's one of the guiding principles of my life.
So a couple more questions.
Yes.
We're almost finished,
Right.
do not worry. So obviously you haven't marched for a while in Mardi Gras, but I'll ask you anyway, how important is grassroots activism compared to, say, the commercialisation, which a lot of people accuse Mardi Gras of being? Can they work together in balance? Do you need a balance? Or has it gone too far one way?
Well, I think you need both, William. I think, you know, that big public manifestation and, you know, sponsorship and all that, it's part of life. And so let that happen, let the crowds be on the street, let's celebrate, let's remember what it stood for, and let's perhaps not forget the original message either. But, you know, grassroots activism, challenging perhaps some more serious issues in society, and to keep doing that, I think they can coexist, working hand in hand, and don't have to be contrary or in conflict.
Is there any advice you'd give to the organisers today of Mardi Gras?
Not especially. I think, you know, to remember and honour that original ethos is important, as long as they do that, and that it's not just about marriage equality, it's much more about that. And just celebrate a bit of transgression. A bit of transgression in life can be very important.
What advice do you have for the activists today?
Young ones?
Young ones or anybody who's new to activism?
Right. I think, you know, to always challenge orthodoxy, especially if you think, gee, we're towing the party line here. Perhaps if you look at the ALP and their attitude to those seeking asylum, it's appalling. And so don't just follow the party line.
That's the Australian Labour Party.
Yes, yes. Yes. Never afraid to be transgressive.
How old were you in 1978?
I was 27.
So what advice would you give to your 27-year-old self?
Oh, I think to do what you did. Yes, to do it. And, the only thing is, you know, should I and would I have got back onto the street? And perhaps in retrospect, I wished I had. And as I say, then probably I would have been arrested, I would have been charged, and I would have been a real hero.
You're living back in Adelaide?
Yep.
You've been back how long?
I was away I lived out of Adelaide for 10 years. So I came back in in 86, that's right.
You were living in Australia?
A year travelling overseas, and then I lived 5 years in Sydney and 4 years in Melbourne. So I was out of Adelaide for 10 years.
So what do you do with your life now?
Well, I still get involved in things at a number of levels. You know, I'm always involved in Feast, and we're having the 21st Feast.
The Feast Festival?
Feast Festival.
Which is the Pride Festival of Adelaide.
Yes, or the Midsummer of Adelaide, yes, and it's celebrating its 21st Feast, 20th anniversary 21st Feast. I have my alter ego, Dr. Gertrude Glossop.
Who does wonderful walking tours.
Yes, thank you very much.
Among many other things, I'm sure.
That's right. So she's often asked to do gigs here and there. And as I say, she's sort of a glamour nana. She's not a drag queen in the traditional sense. She's a persona, my alter ego. And she likes to challenge orthodoxy in a range of ways. You know, she's done art gallery tours and looked at art from a queer lens. She's done wild sex at the zoo, Adelaide Zoo, and at Sydney and Melbourne, and in the UK, and Chester and Dublin zoos, Wellington Zoo.
Really travelled?
Yes, yes.
Wow.
So that's part of my life. I'm retired from professional work in the mental health field, so that gives you more time and energy to do other things. So I think activism and challenging orthodoxy is always important. And the other thing, and that's the thing about Gertrude, perhaps to do with a sense of fun and theatre. Never be too earnest. You know, if you can get people to laugh at the things that would make them cry, lose their poise, fall if you have to, but baby, make a noise. That's on time.
And finally,
yes.
What are your hopes for the future?
My hopes for the future. Well, to live up till I'm a centenarian, to continue activism on some sort of levels, and wouldn't it be lovely if Gertrude did a history walk on her 100th birthday?
Absolutely. And hopefully you'll be walking.
She'd have to wear her flats, I think.
I reckon the heels might be a bit much. Anything else you'd like to add?
No, I think that might do it, William.
Will Sergeant, thank you very much.
My pleasure.